Hello, everyone. I was waiting for a second for the regular Wednesday noon tornado siren to finish going off before I got started. And it seemed to take a little longer today than normal. I want to welcome everybody to the November 2020 Legacies and Lunch, a program of the Central Arkansas Library Center's Butler Center for Arkansas Studies. I'm Heather Register Zabindin, the outreach coordinator for the Bobby L. Roberts Library of Arkansas History and Art. The Roberts Library is located in downtown Little Rock, across Rock Street from the main library, and houses the galleries at Library Square, the Butler Center for Arkansas Studies, and the Encyclopedia of Arkansas. We have new hours for the galleries at Library Square and the Roberts Library Reading Research Room. The galleries at Library Square are now open Wednesdays and Fridays from 10 until 5 and Saturdays from noon until 5. You don't need an appointment to come in. And you can shop and browse. You can shop the retail gallery and you can browse the exhibits we have up right now. The Roberts Library Research Room is open Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 10 to 5. So please call 501-320-5700 to make an appointment and request your materials at least 2 business days in advance. You can go to robertslibrary.org for all the specifics before planning your visit. For details about other CALS branches, please go to cals.org or call your specific branch. We continue to do a lot of virtual programming for the foreseeable future. You can find most of these programs archived at CAL's YouTube channel. So you go to youtube.com and search for the Central Arkansas Library System. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to fill your feed with interesting, fun, and educational content. Today, I'm actually having to live stream this program to YouTube instead of Facebook. Facebook has failed me yet again. So this is on YouTube. So if you know of anybody who normally watches on Facebook, please let them know to go over to the YouTube channel for this live stream if they didn't get into the Zoom. So the speaker will answer questions at the end of the session. You'll be able to type your questions in the chat box in Zoom. And if you can limit your questions to 2 or 3 sentences, that would be great. That would really help me a lot. Now for today's program. Thank you for joining us for Legacies and Lunch, now in its 21st year. Today we have Michael Pierce, an associate professor of history at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville. He will discuss a research project related to an enslaved man, Nelson Hackett, who fled Fayetteville, made it to Canada, and then became the only fugitive that Canada returned to bondage. The Hackett episode prompted the mobilization of abolitionists who lobbied British officials to prevent another such occurrence, and thus safeguarded Canada's status as a refugee for fugitives. Please give a warm welcome to Michael Pierce.
Hey, thank you so much, Heather. It's really great to be here. It's been, I guess, about 15 months since my last Legacy and Lunch. And it was on a quite different topic. I want to talk about the project more broadly before we get into the details. It's part of a larger, a broader project called Arkansas Stories of Place and Belonging. And what Arkansas Stories is, it's a project by a group of humanities scholars, historians, people in the English department, philosophers, art historians. And what we want to do is to present stories about Arkansas, its history, its past, its culture, to present them to a wider public. And so this is part of it. The project is directed by Kathy Sloan, who is the main person behind this. And so far, we've had 4 different projects. One of those focuses on the Trail of Tears through Fayetteville. Another focuses on the Spiral Mounds. George Sabo of the Archaeological Survey and one of the classics professors here are currently developing a virtual reality headset so that you can take a tour of Spiral Mound and look around. We also have a project on captivity in Southeast Arkansas in the 1940s, captivities of Japanese Americans, of Italian POWs, of African Americans through peonage, and what these types of captivities tell us about the place and our state. The goal is to make humanities as essential to the state of Arkansas as STEM, as engineering, as business. We want the humanities to play a prominent role in life in Arkansas, and in academic life. And I am the guy in charge of the Nelson Hackett project. This is one of the 4. This is the last of the 4 to have public presentations, but the first of the 4 to go online with a product, a deliverable, as they say. The reason it's first with a deliverable is simply because a website is a lot easier to put up than a virtual reality thing on the web. And so this is the Nelson Hackett project. And the content was designed by people on the faculty of the University of Arkansas. The project itself was designed by a local firm here in Fayetteville. The website was designed called Red Rooster Design, and Allie Williams and Brad Williams are the married couple behind it. And everything you see when you click onto nelsonhackettproject.uark.edu, they designed the logo, the artwork. The content came from the humanities scholars here at the University of Arkansas. And we thought that the Nelson Hackett story was an appropriate one to tell. It needed a wider audience. As Heather mentioned, Nelson Hackett fled Fayetteville in July of 1841. He made his way across Missouri, crosses the Mississippi River, through the Free States and up into Canada. The guy who owns him follows him and has him extradited for theft. Nelson Hackett stole a saddle, a horse, a gold watch, a fur coat, a formal fur coat, on his way out of Fayetteville, and he was extradited for theft. And he becomes the only such fugitive from American slavery that Canada, the British Empire, returns to bondage in the United States. Let's talk about Hackett himself. I don't know why that is acting up. We don't know much about Hackett. We do know what we do know, start to know, happens when he flees Fayetteville. He flees Fayetteville in July of 1841. And there's 2 versions of his flight, of his running away, of his escape. Alfred Wallace, the man who claimed to own him, the man who had the legal deed that came from the state of Arkansas for him, said that basically Nelson Hackett raped a little girl and knew he was going to be caught and fled and stole stuff on his way out of town. Nelson, while we're pretty sure that there was no rape, Alfred Wallace uses that to build public, to get people angry at at Nelson Hackett, but he never, it's never mentioned in any formal legal proceedings. The abolitionists, though, they say that Hackett fled in a different way. That Wallace and Hackett were at a race, horse race, some distance from Fayetteville, and after the race, Wallace tells Hackett to go back to Fayetteville without him and to take all of these things, and Hackett took the opportunity and just fled. What we do know about Hackett, though, only comes to we only know it because he fled. Soon after he fled, Alfred Wallace registers 2 bills of sale at the Washington County Courthouse. And the image that is on the right on the screen is one of these bills of sale in which Alfred Wallace, that Nelson Hackett, about 24 years of old, was exchanged for a young African-American boy and a mule. And then later he's sold again for $1,000. And so we know these things only because he fled. And we have a record of that. And Hackett flees. He goes north and flees across the state of Missouri. He travels from Fayetteville to the Mississippi River about 360 miles. This is a long distance for a fugitive to go through a slave territory. As I tell people, 360 miles is the distance from Birmingham to Louisville. And so if you can imagine being a fugitive that long, it is an amazing story, but we don't really know what happened. Because we don't have Hackett's words for any of this. We only know what happened to Hackett because other people narrate it. People who are largely unsympathetic to Hackett. And so in order to understand Hackett's motivations, why he does things, we have to look at his actions, his flight, his going to a specific place in Canada, what he does when he is returned to Fayetteville. And those are the only ways we can understand Hackett as the person and his motivation. He flees across Missouri and he heads for a place called Marion City. And Marion City doesn't exist anymore. It fell into the Mississippi River. And Marion City, though, was a hotbed of abolitionist activity. A white abolitionist by the name of David Nelson moved to the area in the early 1830s and set up the Mission Institute, which was sort of a training ground for abolitionists. In 1836, Nelson and the Mission Institute were forced to move across the river to Quincy, Illinois. And at Quincy, David Nelson and his followers set up an operation ferrying fugitives across the Mississippi River. And Quincy becomes this huge starting off point for the Underground Railroad. And I think this point needs to be made clearly, that Hackett knew where he was going. He knew where to cross the Mississippi River. He knew, even probably when he was in Fayetteville, how to hook up with the Underground Railroad in Illinois. And it speaks to the informal networks that existed among enslaved people. And that if we think about it, that Fayetteville in 1841 was not some isolated town. It was not some island community, but was part of a larger network of enslaved people and abolitionists. The enslaved people knew what was going on. In Quincy, Nelson Hackett probably hooks up with the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad started in Quincy. This house on the left, it's a guy named Richard Eels. Eels later runs for president on the Liberty Party ticket, gets arrested for helping slaves, becomes a martyr. But we don't really know how Hackett moves across Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, into Michigan, and into Canada. But we do know that Nelson Hackett arrives in this town over here, Chatham, in Canada West, in early September of 1841. And Chatham, about 50 miles east of Detroit, is referred to in the antebellum era as Canada's Black Mecca. Lots of fugitives, especially from Kentucky, live in that area. And the British philanthropists have opened up a black school. They have a black community center, kind of like a mission. But also the presence of so many fugitives from slavery create white animosity in Chatham. Whites don't want more fugitives moving in. Hackett arrives in early September, as I said. Soon after he arrives, within a week, Alfred Wallace, the man who owns him, shows up. And this suggests that Wallace knew where Hackett was going and that Hackett went to Chatham for some particular reason. Although I don't have any evidence of it, I am assuming, I suspect that Hackett was originally from Kentucky before being forced to move to Washington County. And Wallace has Hackett arrested on September 7th, 1841, charges of theft, while saying that he stole the horse and the saddle, the gold watch, the chain, about $500 worth of coin, and on his way out of Fayetteville. I need to stop for a minute and to tell you that Alfred Wallace was heavily involved with the Fayetteville branch of the Arkansas State Bank. Hackett is leaving in the middle of the Arkansas State Bank crisis with a large amount of coin. What the relationship between Hackett's flight and the bank crisis, we don't know, other than Alfred Wallace is there. And he takes, at least according to Wallace, a substantial amount of specie, of gold and silver coin. Hackett is arrested on charges of theft. He's beaten over the head with a whip, with a butt of a whip and a stick, and allegedly he makes a confession. Hackett will later dispute this confession. He says he didn't know what he was saying, and so after Hackett is arrested here in Chatham, he's taken to the district jail here, a place called Sandwich. It's right across the river from Detroit. And it's at Sandwich, and at Sandwich, what is now Windsor, Ontario. It's at Sandwich that Canadian officials debate what to do with Nelson Hackett. Do they let him go free? Do they punish him there for the theft? Do they send him back to Arkansas? And it's a complicated process, and it's complicated by several things. One, that there's no formal extradition treaty between the British Empire and the United States. And two, the governor of Canada actually dies in the middle of all of this. And there was debates. They last from September of 1841 until late January of 1842. What is Canada going to do with Nelson Hackett? Send him back to Arkansas to stand trial, or let him go free? And Hackett and most abolitionists thought that Canada would let him go free. But a new governor arrives, a guy named Sir Charles Bagot, and he decides that he needs to return Nelson Hackett to Arkansas. And what Bagot says is this. He says, one, it's obvious that Nelson Hackett is guilty of theft. The coat and the watch and the chain and the horse and the saddle were found on him. Everything except the coin. And then the second thing Bagot said is, he says this, and I want to give you the exact quotation. Bagot says allowing fugitives like Hackett to remain in Canada would, quote, convert this province into an asylum for the worst characters. And here, these white Canadians around Chatham, many of them had the same prejudices that whites in the antebellum North had. They didn't want fugitives putting down roots. And Sir Charles Bagot sent Nelson Hackett back. And on February 8th, 1842, in the middle of a night, a representative from the state of Arkansas, someone deputized by Governor Archibald Yale, goes to the Sandwich jail, ties up Nelson Hackett, blindfolds him, and puts him in a boat and transports him across the Detroit River in the middle of the night. I can't imagine being in a boat, tied up, blindfolded, in the middle of winter, going across a busy channel, a busy river. But that is what happens. And Nelson Hackett is taken to the Detroit jail. And here is a drawing of the Detroit jail. And he's held there from early February until April of 1842. And once Nelson Hackett is in the Detroit jail, the Black community in Detroit, and there were about 250 free Blacks living in the Detroit area. Population of Detroit was about 10,000 at this time. And at this time, the Black community reorganizes what is known as the Colored Vigilant Committee. And they begin to investigate. They visit with Nelson Hackett. They sent a lawyer to visit with Nelson Hackett. They look into these proceedings. And what the Colored Vigilant Committee does is it activates a transnational abolitionist community on Nelson Hackett's behalf. They send letters to William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, to Lewis Tappan's newspaper, to abolitionist papers in London and Liverpool, and throughout Canada, to alert the abolitionist community in hopes of preventing Nelson Hackett from being transported from Detroit back to Fayetteville to face punishment for those thefts, or really for running away. And what the Colored Vigilant Committee said is this. They said, Nelson Hackett's not being punished by the state of Arkansas for theft. He's being punished because he absconded from slavery. He's running away. He's not being punished because he stole stuff. He's being punished because he's a fugitive from slavery. And then the Colored Vigilance Committee said this: if such extraditions are allowed to stand, if Nelson Hackett's extradition is allowed to set a precedent, every slaveholder whose enslaved people flee to Canada will make up charges of theft and use those charges of theft to retrieve fugitives. And what the Colored Vigilant Committee said is this: if this is allowed to set a precedent, no fugitive in Canada will be safe. Canada will no longer be a haven for from those fleeing American slavery. In the end, the Colored Vigilant Committee was unable to prevent the return of Nelson Hackett. Once Hackett was sent across the international border, across the Detroit River, Hackett's fate was really kind of sealed. Hackett stayed in Detroit until April of 1842. And why did he stay that long? They had to wait for the ice on the upper Great Lakes to break up. And so in early April of 1842, maybe mid-April of 1842, we're not really sure of the dates, Nelson Hackett and two captors get on a steamship, a Great Lakes steamer, Before they get on, the two captors fit Nelson Hackett with a hobble, a big instrument about 3 feet across, that basically includes chains and makes it difficult for a person with a hobble to actually flee again. And so they take this great, like Hackett's in this contraption, like, and they get on the boats, and the steamer goes up through Lake Huron, the Straits of Mackinac, and down Lake Michigan, to Chicago. Then they get on a stage in Chicago for a 3 or 4 day trip to Peoria. On this trip, on one night, and the last night of this trip, Hackett actually escapes in the town of Princeton. He's unable to connect with the Underground Railroad in Princeton, and the Underground Railroad was quite active in Princeton. And he's captured 2 days later, taken to Peoria, steamboat from Peoria to St. Louis, probably another steamboat from St. Louis down the Mississippi River to the Arkansas River and up to Van Buren and overland. He could have gone overland from St. Louis to Fayetteville. We don't know. The documents are silent on this. But Hackett returns to Fayetteville in the summer of 1842. And there are 2 accounts of his return. One is from Arkansas, one of Arkansas's U.S. senators. We don't know which one, told Arthur and Lewis Tappan, well-known abolitionists, that Hackett was taken back to Fayetteville, beaten, put on trial, beaten again, and then sold to someone down in Texas. The second account of Hackett's return to Fayetteville comes from another enslaved person who was owned by Alfred Wallace, who had escaped to Canada in the 1850s and told abolitionists about what happened to Nelson Hackett 9 years earlier. And what this enslaved man said, and his name was Murdoch, and Murdoch said that Nelson Hackett was brought back to Fayetteville. He was beaten in front of all of the enslaved people in Fayetteville several times. One of the lashings was 125 whips. Some of them were 30, some of them were 50, some of them were 60. And these types of beatings are basically amount to torture. And we also know that Hackett was put on trial. One of the graduate students up here, she's also the university's patent attorney. The agriculture division up here is patent attorney. Her name's Lisa Childs, and she's located the trial transcript. And Hackett was not really a trial with lots of due process. It was returned to Alfred Wallace. Wallace sells him to someone in Texas. That is not the end of the story. The last we hear of Nelson Hackett comes from this document that is over here, and it comes from a abolitionist by the name of Joshua Leavitt. And Joshua Leavitt was one of the abolitionists in the Amistad Affair, prominent abolitionist at the time. And Arkansas's congressman, a guy named Edward Cross. Edward Cross in Washington, D.C. goes to visit Joshua Leavitt to tell him what happens to Nelson Hackett. And what Edward Cross says is that Hackett has escaped a 3rd time and has not been heard from since. And so this is the last we know of Nelson Hackett. Why a Arkansas congressman would take it upon himself to go visit one of the nation's leading abolitionists to tell him what happened to Nelson Hackett, that's going to remain a mystery unless we find additional evidence. Some of the people I've talked to, we've been saying, what does this all mean? And we have no clue. There's a couple possibilities. One is that The people in Arkansas just wants to wash their hands of the whole affair and just saying Hackett disappeared as a way of escaping responsibility. Other people have suggested that maybe the abolitionists had bought Nelson Hackett again and bought him out of slavery. We don't know. And unless more information comes up, we are just speculating. But, and this is important, this is really important, abolitionists like Joshua Levitt, like Arthur and Lewis Tappan, were not going to allow Hackett's extradition back to Arkansas to set a precedent. They were bound and determined to make sure that Nelson Hackett was the last fugitive returned to bondage in the United States, and they were bound and determined to make sure that Canada remained a safe haven. And just at the same time that Hackett was being returned to Arkansas, the US Secretary of State, Daniel Webster, was meeting with a British diplomat, Lord Ashburton, to hammer out a formal treaty between the United States and British North America. Webster, he's this dude over here on your left. Webster and Lord Ashburton had a number of things they wanted to resolve. Boundaries, especially Maine, navigation on the Great Lakes, the policing of the international slave trade, extradition of common criminals. And so in the spring and summer of 1842, these two men hammer out what is known as the Webster-Ashburton Treaty. And for our purposes here, the big thing about it is Article 10. And Article 10 sets up extradition procedures between Canada and the Bahamas on one side and the United States on the other. And what Article 10 on the treaty does is it codified the ideas that were used to justify Hackett's extradition. It opened up the way for extradition to be used on all of these other fugitives in the same way it was used on Hackett. And so the abolitionists that I've talked about, Lewis Tappan, Arthur Tappan, Joshua Levitt, and another guy named Garrett Smith, they were bound and determined to stop, or at least to modify Article 10 so that it couldn't be used to secure the return of fugitives like Hackett. And so in August of 1842, Lewis Tappan and Garrett Smith, they go to visit Lord Ashburton before Ashburton leaves Washington, D.C., where he had hammered out the treaty. And Tappan and Smith, they know full well that the United States government is not going to be sympathetic to them. They see people like Daniel Webster, and they see the federal government as too complicit in slavery. And so Tappan and Garrett Smith go and they try to lobby Lord Ashburton. And when they lobby Lord Ashburton, all they can talk about is Nelson Hackett. Nelson Hackett this, Nelson Hackett that. We're going to have hundreds of Nelson Hacketts if Webster Ashburton isn't modified or changed. Lord Ashburton actually gave assurances to Tappan and Garrett Smith. He said, look, we'll make sure that this is not abused by slaveholders. We'll take extra precautions. And actually, Tappan and Smith were somewhat satisfied. But they said, this is the best we as Americans can do. That true change of Webster Ashburton will have to come from the British government, and the demands will have to come from British subjects. And so when Ashburton goes back to England, he takes the treaty, and the treaty has to be ratified by Parliament, both the House of Lords and the House of Commons. And British abolitionists are ready. And the leader of these British abolitionists is this guy over here on the right. His name is Thomas Clarkson. And Thomas Clarkson is up there with Wilberforce as the most prominent British abolitionist. And Clarkson says, you know, we cannot allow Article 10 to go unmodified. He says, he rehearses the arguments against it. Theft will be used as a pretext for claiming all fugitives. He also, and the abolitionists also say, they echo what John Quincy Adams said in the Amistad case. They said, look, legally in the United States, slaves are chattel. Slaves are property. And property cannot, what is legal property cannot be tried or held responsible for one's actions. As John Quincy Adams said in the Amistad case, you can't put a cow on trial. And legally, there was no difference between an enslaved human being and a cow. He says, according to American law, both are chattel, both are property. And that it's hypocritical of slave owners and slave states to treat slaves as chattel when they want to, and then as responsible humans when they want to. You can't have it both ways. People like Clarkson, people like John Quincy Adams were saying. But and lastly, what Clarkson and his allies, abolitionists in England, were saying is that there's no way enslaved people can get fair trials in the United States, especially in the South, and you can't have extradition without the expectation of fair trials. And so these are the arguments that the abolitionists made. And in each argument, Hackett was at the center. As one abolitionist, not Clarkson, another one said, Hackett was returned to Fayetteville, where he was in, quote, the fangs of tyrants. And you can't expect a tyrant to give a fair trial to an enslaved person. So House of Lords takes up Article 10, takes up Webster Ashburton. Abolitionists in the House of Lords try to get it changed. And Lord Stanley, the minister for the colonies, he gets up in the House of Lords and he makes assurances. He says, look, England is committed to preserving, to abolition of slavery. England will make sure that extradition requests can only come from the federal US government, not from individual states. The British government will monitor all of these requests very closely. These assurances appease, I guess, the leader of the abolitionists in the House of Lords. And they kind of sign off on it. But in the House of Commons, the abolitionists are not as easily mollified. And a guy named Lord Palmerston, he later becomes prime minister. He's head of the Whig Party. He is the one who takes up the fight against Article 10. And again, bringing Nelson Hackett in. And what in the House of Commons Palmerston is able to get is more assurances. Prime Minister Robert Peel says, we will make sure this is not abused. But Peel and the Tory party that was responsible, the majority party, they said, look, if we modify Article 10 in any way, the United States Senate will not go along and will reject the entire treaty. And so Article 10 is enacted. But as soon as it does, Robert Peel's government, the Prime Minister's office, has instructions sent out to Canada and to the Bahamas about how to enforce it. What are the proper procedures? And these procedures are so exacting as to make any extradition almost impossible. And once the abolitionists read these instructions, they realized that they had won, that Article 10 could not be used, that Nelson Hackett would be the last. In fact, a year after Article 10 was the Webster-Ashburton Act was treaty was put into effect, and Article 10 came into being, it was tested. And the test of Article 10 was not in Canada, but in the Bahamas. A fugitive from Florida actually kills the guy who claims to own him during an escape. The fugitive makes his way to the Bahamas, and the state of Florida demands his extradition on charges of murder, citing Article 10. Colonial officials in the Bahamas reject the request based on Article 10. What they say is this. They say, one, we need evidence of guilt. And two, they say, it's not from the extradition request, is not from the federal government in DC, it's from the state of Florida. Therefore, it's null and void. And then the third thing, and this is the really, really important thing. Killing a master during an escape is considered to be self-defense in the Bahamas, where slavery is illegal. Therefore, what the fugitive did in Florida is not a crime in the Bahamas, and therefore he cannot be extradited. When this case was settled, when the fugitive was given his freedom in the Bahamas, the abolitionists declared Act 10 is dead. It cannot be used to extradite fugitives. And the abolitionists, Joshua Levitt and the Tappan brothers and Joshua Giddings and Garrett Smith, they said the reason Act 10 cannot be used to extradite fugitives is because we made such a fuss and we forced the debate. And at the center of these debates was Nelson Hackett. And so Nelson Hackett, in this very, very critical, crucial way, helps ensure that Canada remains a haven for fugitives from American slavery. What does this all mean? What does this all mean? Why are we telling this story? Well, one of the reasons we're telling it in Fayetteville is people in Fayetteville, including I'm one of them, they like to tout their unionist past during the Civil War, their integrationist past during the civil rights movement, the integration of the Fayetteville public schools, the integration of the University of Arkansas. The only thing that people in Fayetteville do better than celebrating its unionist past and its integrationist past is forgetting the importance of slavery in the town's development. Forgetting how important Jim Crow and disfranchisement were to the development of Fayetteville. And so in a way, this is a community remembrance, a reminder of the inequities of our past. But also what it means, this is a story of human agency. Even though Nelson Hackett was enslaved, he was in a position, he was considered chattel. Through his initiative, through his actions, he transforms North America and helps do his part to ensure that Canada and the Bahamas remain havens for fugitives. But it also means, and what the story also means, is that even though humans have agency, they exercise that agency in context. Hackett, what he did is activated networks of people working to abolish slavery. These networks expanded or were in the United States, in Canada, in Great Britain, and these people they communicated. It was abolitionists in Marion City and Quincy. It was free blacks in Detroit and free blacks throughout Canada, and these transnational abolitionist communities. Fayetteville, Arkansas, we are not isolated. We are part of these things. And it's this combination of human agency and abolitionist networks that make sure Canada is secure for fugitives. And I want to end this by talking about what fugitivity means. Slaves, enslaved people fleeing to Canada was one of the two leading factors driving the sectional crisis that led to civil war. Fugitives, arguments over fugitive slave law, arguments over personal liberty laws, Uncle Tom's Cabin, novels about these types of things drove the sectional crisis, along with issues of slavery in the West. The sectional crisis that erupted into civil war and led to the abolition of slavery in the United States. And so these stories are important for understanding that. And they need to be told to wider communities so that we can understand not only about ourselves, but human agency and activist networks. And so I guess that's as good a place to stop as any. And so thank you. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. This is fascinating. I wrote down a couple of comments, and then we do have a couple of questions. I think I said this to you before when we were chatting before we were online. I am super excited about the accessibility of this information on the website. In a previous life, I worked on a project about the Rower Relocation Center in Southwest Arkansas. And so, Southeast Arkansas. And so I knew about that one, but the fact that the university has this whole initiative to do a series of these is wonderful, because it's, looking at the website, it's simple and it's approachable. It's not, tons and tons of information that can, in reality, scare people away, the lay person.
Well, one of the things that we were trying to do with the website was to mix a sort of a narrative that was created by scholars with primary sources. And so you can click on you can see documents, you can see articles in typeface, you can see letters that people wrote talking about this. One of my favorites is a letter from Lewis Tappan, the abolitionist, to Edward Cross, talking about Nelson Hackett's return to Fayetteville. And so these are great tools that I hope people can use in the classroom to talk about the importance of primary sources, the difference between primary sources and secondary sources, the craft of what historians do. And so, I think that's also a byproduct of all of this.
Yeah.
And so we hope it makes a bigger splash.
Well, and, right now we're in the middle of a pandemic, so people can't go to places, but for kids, for, secondary school kids, an archive, going into an archive is a daunting task if they even think about wanting to go there. So to be able to access it through the internet, it's great. I'm very impressed.
Thank you.
And I loved your comment about, the fact that there was slavery in Northwest Arkansas. I think that for most people, they think about Arkansas as, slavery is in the southern part of the state, and there wasn't any slavery in the northern part of the state.
One of the things that I found, is that in the 1840 census, Fayetteville was 28% enslaved. And so Fayetteville had a higher percentage of enslaved people than the state as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
But not only that, if you look at the sex ratios and the ages, there's a disproportionate number of young female enslaved people, and what it looks like, and is that young women were investments
Mm-hmm.
who could produce additional slaves. And so, I mean, in the harshest terms, the white people of Fayetteville were marketing, selling human beings for profit and having them bred for that. And that is something that I think, any town looking at its past has to reckon with.
Yes. Okay, we have a question from Guy Lancaster.
Hi, Guy.
It's long. Because it's
really, Guy.
I know he's laughing with us. So he says, there at one point was actually a growing abolitionist movement in the South, but as the nation became more polarized, Southern abolitionists were driven, murdered, or driven away. Does the Nelson Hackett case shed any light on the existence of any sort of abolitionist movement here in Arkansas?
I've been looking for it. Lisa Childs, the graduate student who's been working on this with me, has been looking for it, and we haven't. But what to kind of answer that, David Nelson, the abolitionist who set up in Missouri, he just south of Hannibal, or just north of Hannibal, he set up this abolitionist hub there. There was a small college and he brought in abolitionists from Ohio and Indiana. And the reaction was so violent to his presence in Missouri that the pro-slavery forces basically drove them out of Missouri across the river. And so there is that type of backlash. And one of the, I don't know if this really is answering Guy's question, but I'll tell you anyways. As Nelson Hackett was crossing the Mississippi River at Marion City and Quincy, 3 white abolitionists from Quincy were arrested in Missouri for helping slaves move across the river. And these 3 men, Burr, Thompson, and what's the last guy's name? Work, were sentenced to 15 years of hard labor, and they became martyrs to this abolitionist cause, white men who are willing to suffer to help eliminate slavery. But we have their prison diaries. And at one point, in Allenson Work's prison diary, right at the same time Nelson Hackett would have been going through this area, he writes, "We heard a slave made it across the Mississippi River last night." And, I keep thinking, is that Nelson Hackett? And there's, of course, there's no name to it, but, there are these networks of people that are invested in abolition and helping enslaved people escape.
Yeah. You want to believe it's referencing him. I know that feeling. So yeah. David Strickland says, great talk, Michael. Was Hackett cited in the debates a few years later that led to the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act?
Not that we know of. We've looked and looked and looked. But the interesting, and again, I'm answering a question David didn't ask, but I'll go ahead and say this. The same year that Nelson Hackett's returned, the same year that the Webster-Ashburton Treaty is signed, the United States Supreme Court, in a decision called Prigg v. Pennsylvania, really restricts the ability of northern states to protect fugitives. And so it's like, as the ability of fugitives to find safety in the northern states evaporates, is the same time that Nelson, Hackett, and the abolitionists make sure that Canada remains a haven. And so so Prigg v. Pennsylvania, as I'm sure David knows, is sort of like the precursor to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And so there's some synchronicity going on.
So Ed Nelson says, it seems to me that Arkansas congressman was probably a messenger between slaveholder and abolitionist with offer of a gray market sale of Hackett to end situation.
Yeah, and people have talked about that. That's the only reason. We're trying to figure out why Edward Cross would go visit Joshua Leavitt. Why, Edward Cross was, he's from Washington, down in Hempstead County. It's the Red River cotton industry at that time. And so why he would go visit one of the most austere Calvinistic abolitionist is beyond me, and something's going on. We just don't. We have no evidence as to what. We can only speculate.
Yeah. Okay. One last question from Guy. He says, it seems to me there are some parallels between the British refusal to extradite fugitive slaves and the later actions of the Northern and Midwestern governors in refusing to extradite Southern African Americans who might face lynching back home, such as Robert Hill, who fled to Kansas after the Elaine massacre, or Stephen Green, who fled to Chicago after a conflict with a local plantation owner ended in murder. Any comment?
Yeah, and I think that makes sense. Part of this that is in the website that I didn't talk about is the reaction of politicians in Canada. And there's a colonial assembly up in Canada. And Nelson Hackett gets debated. And you can read about it on the website. And so the same arguments that Salmon Chase made about Ohio's personal liberty laws are the same ones that were being made in Kingston in 1842 in the Canadian Colonial Assembly, and so there is a similarity there, and some of these people are like, slavery is just wrong, and we just don't want any part of it, and others of it is a more legalistic argument about. When the governor of Kansas was talking about returning Hill to Arkansas, he said, "There's no way Hill's going to get a fair trial." And the people in the Colonial Assembly in Canada said, "There's no fair trials in Arkansas, and for enslaved people, and so there's no extradition is meaningless in those cases, and can't work and shouldn't work." Mm-hmm. And so. Yeah. So Guy's right. As always.
Yeah, I was going to say, he usually is. Well, thank you so much. I have put the web address in the chat for anybody who would like to check out the website. I hope everybody will, because like I said, I'm really impressed with it. It gives a lot of information and has been wonderful to explore.
Thank you. And thank everyone. Thank you, Heather. Thank you, David. Thank to everyone at the Butler Center and CALS.
Well, thanks for being here. And next month, we have Aquila Marie Walker, who is an artist, a local Little Rock artist who does photography. And she has an exhibition up at our Loft Gallery right now. So come back on December 2nd. I had to look at my board to see what December 2nd. So it's the first Wednesday of the month, like always, at noon. And on the 18th of November, we're going to have a second kind of legacies and lunch. It's rescheduled from April when this pandemic all started. Kathy Calloway will be with us to talk about the Vietnam War in literature. So that should be really fascinating. So thank you again, Michael. This was great. Like I said, the website's great. Please go check it out, and we'll see everybody next